Imagine a world turned upside down. What if everything you knew, your home, your family, your very identity, was ripped away in an instant? What if your safety, your future, even your body, became property of a conqueror? Step back into 670 AD and witness the unseen struggles that reshaped women's lives in territories newly brought under foreign rule. Number 7. The shadow of enslavement. Picture a morning like any other, the sun rising over olive groves or fertile riverbanks, children playing, women preparing food. But then, a distant rumble, a cloud of dust on the horizon, and the air fills with the terrifying sound of foreign tongues and clashing metal. For countless women in newly conquered territories around 670, this was not a nightmare, but a brutal reality. The immediate aftermath of conquest often meant the horrifying prospect of enslavement, a fate that could descend upon anyone regardless of their previous standing or wealth. It was a practice deeply embedded in the ancient and early medieval world, and military victories were a primary source of new enslaved populations. When invaders swept through a town or village, the initial chaos was absolute. Houses were plundered, lives extinguished, and people seized. Women, often seen as valuable spoils of war, were particularly vulnerable. They might be grabbed from their homes, dragged away from their screaming children, their pleas for mercy unheard. Terror of that moment, the sudden shift from freedom to captivity, must have been utterly paralyzing. Imagine the feeling of your hands being bound, your movements restricted, your very will crushed in an instant. Chroniclers from the era, though often focusing on battles and kings, sometimes provide glimpses into the massive movements of people, often describing entire populations being uprooted and taken as captives. The journey away from their homes was often just as horrific as the initial capture. Forced marches stretched for days, sometimes weeks, across desolate landscapes. Women, already traumatized and likely poorly fed, were compelled to walk distances they could barely manage, often carrying young children or tending to the elderly. The roads were littered with those who collapsed from exhaustion, hunger, or disease. There was little clean water, and the threat of illness was constant in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of a marching column. Mothers watched their children sicken, powerless to help. Sisters saw their siblings fall, unable to even mourn properly. The air would have been thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and desperation, punctuated by the cries of the vulnerable and the harsh commands of the guards. Arrival at a designated slave market was a further act of profound dehumanization. Whether in bustling urban centers like Damascus, Cairo, or Cordoba, or smaller regional hubs, these markets were places where human beings became commodities. Women, often stripped of their personal coverings and forced to stand on display, were inspected, prodded, and assessed like livestock. Their physical attributes, their age, their perceived health, everything was scrutinized. The humiliation of such an experience, to be bought and sold, to have your future determined by the whims of a stranger, is almost impossible to comprehend. This was where families were often irreversibly torn apart. A mother might be sold to one master, her daughter to another, never to see each other again. The bonds of kinship, which had provided comfort and strength for generations, were shattered with a single transaction. Accounts from various historical traditions, though rarely direct, often describe the mechanisms of these markets, hinting at the vast numbers of people funneled through them after conquests. Once purchased, the life of an enslaved woman in 670 AD was one of relentless servitude. Their specific duties varied widely based on the needs of their new owners. Many were forced into domestic service, cleaning, cooking, grinding, grain, fetching water, and tending to the children of their captors. This might sound benign compared to other fates, but it meant constant labor from dawn until dusk, often with little rest or appreciation. They were at the beck and call of their masters and mistresses, their lives entirely dictated by others. Others found themselves toiling in agriculture, working the fields under the scorching sun or tending to livestock, a physically demanding existence that took a heavy toll on their bodies. In other instances, enslaved women might be put to work in nascent industries, like spinning or weaving, or in workshops producing goods for trade. No matter the task, it was a life without autonomy, a constant reminder of their loss of freedom. Perhaps one of the most insidious aspects of enslavement was the systematic attempt to strip away the enslaved woman's former identity. Her name might be changed to something more pleasing or convenient for her new owners. Her language, if different from that of her captors, might be forbidden or discouraged, forcing her to learn a new tongue or face punishment. Her religion, the faith that had guided her and her ancestors for centuries, was often suppressed or outright replaced. She might be forced to adopt the conqueror's beliefs, to attend their religious ceremonies, to abandon the practices that had defined her spiritual life. This erasure of identity was a profound psychological violence aimed at breaking the spirit and severing all ties to the past. It was a way to make the enslaved woman fit into her new diminished role, to forget who she once was and accept who she was now forced to be. The constant fear was another crushing burden. The fear of punishment for minor infractions, the fear of abuse, the fear of being sold again to another, perhaps crueler, master. This perpetual anxiety meant that true peace was a luxury never afforded. Even if a woman found herself in a relatively kind household, the underlying power dynamic was always present. Her existence was conditional, her body and her labor not her own. The records we have from the period, while not always focusing on individual stories, provide enough context to understand that the lives of enslaved people were precarious and often fraught with hardship. It was not uncommon for enslaved women to be gifted, inherited, or traded as part of larger property transactions, further emphasizing their status as chattel rather than human beings with rights or feelings. Even women who had once held positions of considerable respect or wealth in their previous societies were not exempt from this fate. Conquest leveled all social distinctions in the initial moments of capture, and a princess could find herself enslaved alongside a peasant. The shadow of enslavement was long and dark, casting a pall over the lives of countless women in the territories that found themselves under new rule in 670. Number 6. The peril of displaced lives. Imagine waking up to a world that no longer recognizes you. Your home, the very ground you stand on, has suddenly become foreign territory. For women in newly conquered lands around 670 AD, the reality was often one of forced displacement, a mass exodus from everything familiar, a terrifying journey into an unknown future. This was not a choice. It was a desperate flight for survival, or a coerced march at the hands of the new rulers. The immediate aftermath of conquest often meant that entire populations, or significant portions of them, were uprooted from their ancestral lands. The decision, or often the necessity, to leave was abrupt and heartbreaking. There was little time to gather possessions, to prepare for a long and arduous journey. Women would have made impossible choices, deciding which precious few items could be carried. Perhaps a pot for cooking, a warm covering, a small amount of dried food, or a child's beloved toy. All else, the accumulated memories and tools of a lifetime, had to be abandoned. The family home built by generations, with its familiar smells and comforting nooks, was left behind, likely to be looted or repurposed by the conquerors. Ancestral lands, the fields that had sustained families for centuries, the olive groves or vineyards that represented their livelihood, were relinquished, knowing they might never see them again. The familiar paths, the local market, the sacred spaces, all were left in the dust, replaced by the terrifying prospect of an endless road. Historical accounts, often sparse on civilian details, nonetheless hint at the vast numbers of refugees and migrants describing long lines of people moving away from conflict zones. The journey itself was a brutal test of endurance. Most often, it was undertaken on foot, across varied and unforgiving terrain. Women, burdened by children, often carrying babies in their arms or on their backs, struggled alongside the elderly and the infirm. They moved in large, desperate columns, vulnerable to attack, exposure, and disease. Food and water were scarce, and the sick and weak often fell by the wayside, unable to continue. The psychological toll of such a journey must have been immense. Constant fear, gnawing hunger, profound grief for what was lost, and overwhelming anxiety about what lay ahead. Each step was a step further away from security and comfort, deeper into uncertainty. The sounds would have been a cacophony of coughing, crying, weary footsteps, and the murmurs of exhausted despair seeking refuge was another perilous stage. Sometimes, these displaced populations tried to find safety in larger, unconquered cities, hoping for anonymity and protection within their walls. But these cities were often ill-equipped to handle such an influx of people. They became overcrowded, resources stretched thin, and sanitation became a major problem, leading to outbreaks of disease. Other times, refugees found themselves in temporary camps, makeshift shelters erected in open fields, offering little protection from the elements or from further threats. Still others were forced to migrate to entirely unfamiliar lands, places where their language was not spoken, their customs not understood, and where they faced suspicion or outright hostility from the existing inhabitants. The challenges of resettlement were immense. Even if they found a place to stop the struggle, to find food, clean water, and adequate shelter was relentless. Without their lands or their tools, women who had once been farmers, artisans, or skilled homemakers found themselves without means of livelihood. They might resort to begging, offering meager services, or engaging in desperate trade to secure enough food for their families. Discrimination from the existing populace was a constant threat, as refugees were often seen as a burden, a drain on resources, or even as a potential fifth column for the conquerors. This made finding work, securing safe housing, or integrating into a new community incredibly difficult. Trauma of displacement was not a fleeting event, but a prolonged experience of anxiety and insecurity. It instilled a deep sense of rootlessness, a feeling of not belonging anywhere, and a profound longing for a home that no longer existed. The psychological impact of displacement was profound and long-lasting. Women, who were often the keepers of the home and the family's social ties, bore the brunt of this disruption. They had lost not only their physical homes, but also their sense of community, their network of support from neighbors, friends, and extended family. The rituals of daily life, the traditions that marked the seasons, the shared stories and laughter, all were gone. Constant state of alertness, the fear of discovery or further upheaval could lead to chronic stress and trauma. Children, particularly vulnerable, suffered from malnutrition, disease, and the pervasive fear of their parents. The sense of profound loss, the grief for a life that was irrevocably altered, weighed heavily. Scholars who have studied patterns of migration and conquest note how communities that had existed for centuries were shattered by these events, their social structures dismantled, their collective memory fractured. The peril of displaced lives was a silent, ongoing brutality, a continuous struggle for survival, and a profound struggle to rebuild a semblance of normalcy in a world that had literally been turned upside down. Number 5. The scars of sexual violence. It is a grim and undeniable reality of warfare throughout history, and the conquests around 670 AD were no exception, that women often faced the horrific threat of sexual violence. This was not merely an unfortunate byproduct of conflict. In many instances, it was a deliberate tactic of terror, a way to break the spirit of the conquered population, or a brutal consequence of a lack of discipline among conquering forces. While historical records from this period often speak in veiled terms, or omit such atrocities, entirely given the societal norms of the time, various accounts from later centuries, combined with the consistent patterns of warfare across millennia, leave little doubt that such events were a brutal and widespread reality for women in newly conquered territories. Imagine the absolute vulnerability of being a woman in a town or village overrun by an invading army. Chaos of battle might have subsided, but the threat continued long after the fighting ended. Conquerors, flushed with victory and sometimes fueled by a sense of entitlement over the defeated, often viewed women as spoils of war, as property to be claimed and abused. The fear that permeated the air was not just of death, but of something far more intimate and devastating. Women would hide if they could, in cellars, in abandoned buildings, or beneath piles of rubbish, desperately hoping to evade detection. But hiding was often futile in the face of widespread searches and plunder. The physical scars of such violence, though often hidden, were profound. Beyond the immediate pain and injury, there was the risk of unwanted pregnancy, a terrifying prospect in a world with limited medical knowledge and severe social stigma. Childbirth under such circumstances would have been dangerous and emotionally fraught, leaving a woman with a constant living reminder of her trauma. Toll on the body was immense, but it was often the psychological scars that proved to be the most enduring. The loss of dignity and bodily autonomy was a devastating blow. A woman's sense of self, her fundamental right to control her own body, was violently stripped away. This violation left deep wounds on her spirit, eroding her trust in others, making her feel permanently defiled. For a woman in this era, whose identity and social standing were often deeply intertwined with her honor and perceived purity, such an experience could lead to profound isolation and despair. Societal stigma sadly often compounded the suffering of victims. Rather than being seen as survivors of horrific crimes, women who had experienced sexual violence might be shunned by their own communities, their marriage prospects ruined, their lives irrevocably altered by the prejudice of others. This added an unbearable layer of shame and loneliness to an already immense burden. The long-term trauma of sexual violence was a silent epidemic. It manifested in various ways: nightmares, flashbacks, an inability to feel safe, a deep-seated fear of men, and a profound sense of powerlessness. Trust, once broken, might never be fully restored, making intimate relationships difficult, if not impossible. A woman might withdraw from society, consumed by her pain, or struggle to find a way to live with the indelible memories of her experience. The laughter and joy that once defined her might be replaced by a quiet sorrow that never truly left. This suffering, though rarely recorded in formal histories, passed down through generations in whispered stories and unspoken pain. Furthermore, sexual violence was sometimes used as a calculated strategy. It was a way to demoralize the conquered population, to sow fear and discord, and to demonstrate the absolute power of the new rulers. When women, the perceived pillars of family and community, were targeted, the psychological impact on the entire group was immense. It was a brutal message that resistance was futile, and that the conquerors held absolute dominion. Conversely, in many instances, such violence was a product of a breakdown in military discipline, where soldiers given license during conquest engaged in horrific acts without restraint. While some commanders attempted to impose discipline, the chaos of war often rendered such efforts difficult. The few historical references that touch upon these issues, whether through codes of conduct that forbid such acts or through veiled lamentations and chronicles, highlight the omnipresent nature of this threat during periods of conquest. The scars of sexual violence were a brutal and tragic reality for women in newly conquered territories, a deep and enduring wound on the fabric of their lives, their families, and their communities. Number 4. The shackles of shifting laws. Imagine waking up one day to find that the very rules governing your life, your family, and your property have been fundamentally changed. What was once right is now wrong. What was yours is no longer yours. For women in newly conquered territories around 670, the introduction of a new legal system by the conquerors was a profound and often brutal reality. Before the conquest, various societies across the Byzantine Empire, the former Sasanian lands, and other regions possessed diverse legal codes. Some granted women certain rights, such as the ability to own property, inherit from their parents, or even initiate divorce under specific circumstances. These rights were often built over generations, reflecting the customs and traditions of their specific cultures. The arrival of the new rulers, however, came their own legal framework, often based on their distinct cultural, religious, and social norms. In many cases, these new laws significantly altered or even stripped away rights that women had previously enjoyed. One of the most immediate impacts was on property ownership. In some pre-conquest societies, women could own land, receive dowries that remained their personal property, or inherit shares of family wealth. Under new legal systems, these provisions might be curtailed or eliminated entirely. A woman might suddenly find that the land she had farmed with her family for years was no longer hers, or that her inheritance was drastically reduced or even transferred to male relatives under the new legal interpretations. This meant a loss of economic independence and security, making women more reliant on male family members or the charity of others. Historical scholars who compare legal documents from pre- and post-conquest periods often highlight these significant shifts in property rights for women. Marriage and divorce were other areas profoundly affected. In many of the conquered lands, marriage customs were deeply rooted in local traditions, allowing for various forms of unions and sometimes a woman's ability to seek separation or divorce if a marriage became unbearable. The new legal systems, however, introduced their own marital laws, which often differed significantly. These could include stricter rules about who a woman could marry, limitations on her ability to initiate divorce, or changes in the terms of marriage settlements. For instance, in some conquered areas, the new laws might permit a man to have multiple wives, a concept that might have been foreign or restricted in the previous legal framework. This could lead to complex family dynamics, competition among co-wives, and increased insecurity for women within their own households. The idea of a woman's consent in marriage might also be reinterpreted or disregarded in favor of male guardianship. Guardianship over children also underwent significant changes. In some previous systems, a widowed mother might have clear rights over her children. Under the new laws, these rights could be transferred to paternal relatives or the new husband, potentially separating a mother from her offspring or reducing her influence over their upbringing and future. The very structure of the family and a woman's place within it was redefined by these legal shifts. Beyond property and family, new legal codes often imposed changes on women's public lives. This could include restrictions on their movement outside the home, stricter dress codes, or limitations on their interaction with men who were not close relatives. What was once accepted behavior in public spaces might now be considered scandalous or even illegal. This profound shift meant that women had to navigate a completely new social landscape, constantly fearing that they might inadvertently violate a law they barely understood. The confusion and fear of not understanding the new rules, combined with the lack of legal recourse, added an immense burden to their daily lives. Imagine the anxiety of not knowing if a simple act, like walking to the market alone, could lead to trouble. These legal changes were not just abstract concepts on parchment. They were shackles that fundamentally altered the daily lives of women. They could strip away generations of accumulated rights and protections, leaving women vulnerable and without a clear legal standing. Previous social safety nets, often based on community norms and informal agreements, were eroded as the new formal legal structures took hold. Women, who were often less likely to be literate or have access to legal scholars, found themselves at an immense disadvantage, navigating a system that was alien and often indifferent to their previous customs, while conquerors sometimes allowed local customs to persist to a degree, especially initially. The overarching legal framework of the new power often slowly but surely superseded them. This meant that the rules that had defined a woman's life, her family, and her future were no longer hers to understand or control, but were imposed from above, often without her consent or benefit. This imposition of new laws was a silent but relentless brutality, reshaping women's destinies in profound and often detrimental ways. Number 3. The hunger of lost livelihoods. Imagine the sudden disappearance of everything that sustains you. The fields lie fallow, the markets are empty, and the familiar routines of earning a living have vanished. For women in newly conquered territories around 670 AD, economic hardship was not merely a setback, but a crushing reality that often led to widespread hunger, disease, and despair. Conquest was, by its very nature, incredibly disruptive to established economies. When armies marched through, they often destroyed farms, pillaged granaries, and disrupted crucial trade routes that supplied food and goods. The very infrastructure of daily life was shattered. The immediate impact on family income was devastating. In many societies of the era, the economy was agrarian, and families relied on the harvest of their lands. When these lands were seized, burned, or left uncultivated due to ongoing conflict, the primary source of food and income disappeared. Men who were often the primary providers might be killed in battle, enslaved, or forced to flee, leaving women to fend for themselves and their children with no resources. Women, who also played crucial roles in the economy, from managing households and small farms to engaging in crafts like spinning, pottery, or preparing food for market, found their traditional livelihoods severely impacted. The tools they used might be destroyed, the raw materials unavailable, or the markets where they sold their goods simply ceased to exist. Imagine being a skilled weaver, but having no access to wool or thread, or a farmer with no land to plant. The scarcity of basic necessities quickly became acute. Food, once abundant or at least reliably available, became a precious commodity. Water sources might be contaminated or difficult to access safely. Basic supplies like salt, cooking oil, or lamp fuel became luxuries. This widespread scarcity quickly led to skyrocketing prices for any goods that could be found, putting them far out of reach for most of the population. The daily struggle to find enough to eat was paramount. Women, often responsible for feeding their families, would have spent endless hours foraging for edible plants, bartering precious family heirlooms for a handful of grain, or waiting desperately for any form of aid. Historical accounts from various regions often speak of widespread famine and distress following military campaigns, indicating how severely these disruptions impacted the civilian population. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making people more susceptible to disease. Outbreaks of illnesses like dysentery, typhus, and smallpox ravaged communities already weakened by hunger and stress. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable, dying in horrifying numbers. For women, especially those who were pregnant or nursing, the lack of adequate nutrition could lead to complications in childbirth and an inability to nourish their infants, resulting in high rates of infant mortality. The cycle of poverty and poor health was relentless. The desperation of trying to feed one's family in such circumstances led to agonizing choices. Some women might be forced into desperate measures, such as selling off what few possessions they had left, or even in extreme cases, selling their own children into servitude in the hope that they might at least survive. Begging became a common sight in the streets of cities and towns as people who had once been independent and productive were reduced to relying on charity. The social safety nets that existed in pre-conquest societies, such as community granaries or mutual aid networks, often collapsed under the immense pressure of widespread hardship. Even if a conqueror eventually sought to re-establish some form of order, the economic recovery was a slow and painful process. New tax systems were often imposed, sometimes quite heavily, on an already impoverished populace, further squeezing their resources. Previous economic structures might be replaced with new ones that favored the conquerors or their loyalists, leaving the indigenous population, especially women, at a significant disadvantage. The knowledge and skills that had once been economically viable might no longer be relevant in the new economic landscape. The hunger of lost livelihoods was not just a temporary inconvenience. It was a profound systemic collapse that pushed countless women and their families to the brink of survival, shaping their lives with the constant gnawing pain of scarcity and the fear of an empty future. Number 2. The weight of cultural erasure. Imagine a world where the songs your grandmother sang are forgotten, the stories your elders told are silenced, and the very language of your heart is deemed undesirable. For women in newly conquered territories around 670, the weight of cultural erasure was a heavy and insidious reality. Conquest was not just about military victory. It was often about establishing a new order, a new identity for the land and its people. This frequently involved the systematic suppression or outright replacement of existing cultural practices, beliefs, and languages. Language was often one of the first targets. Conquerors brought their own tongue, and it quickly became the language of power, administration, and commerce. Children in schools, if schools continued to exist, might be compelled to learn the new language, with their native tongue gradually falling out of use. For women, who were often the primary educators of young children and the keepers of oral traditions, this created a profound challenge. How do you pass on your heritage when the very words you use are becoming obsolete or even forbidden? Imagine trying to communicate with officials or traders in a language you barely understood, or watching your children adopt a new way of speaking that estranged them from their own parents. This linguistic shift was a subtle form of violence, severing a fundamental connection to one's past and identity. Religious changes were another massive burden. The conquered lands were home to diverse faiths, various Christian denominations, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and local pagan beliefs. The new rulers often brought with them a new religion, which they sought to propagate. This could range from subtle social pressure to outright forced conversion, the destruction of existing temples, churches, or synagogues, and the suppression of previous religious rituals and practices. For women, religion was often deeply intertwined with their daily lives, their community structures, their sense of morality, and their hopes for the afterlife. To have their sacred spaces defiled, their holy texts forbidden, or their cherished ceremonies outlawed was a profound spiritual trauma. Some women might have secretly continued their old practices, whispering prayers in the quiet of their homes, but this defiance came with immense risk. Pressure to conform, to adopt the conqueror's faith, was immense, often tied to social acceptance or economic opportunity. Archaeological findings from this period often reveal layers of cultural change, showing older religious sites being repurposed or demolished, replaced by new structures, a silent testament to this transformation. Beyond language and religion, countless other aspects of daily culture faced erasure. Traditional attire, which often conveyed social status, regional identity, or marital status, might be replaced by new modes of dress. Songs and music which carried the history and emotion of a people might be deemed inappropriate or simply overshadowed by the conqueror's own artistic expressions. Stories and oral histories passed down through generations around hearths and in public gatherings could be forgotten as new narratives of the conqueror's glory took precedence. Local festivals, rituals, and customs that marked the turning of the seasons or celebrated life events might be suppressed or replaced by new holidays and ceremonies. This cultural suppression impacted women particularly deeply because they were often the primary custodians of these traditions within the family and community. They taught the children the songs, told the stories, prepared the traditional foods, and kept the old customs alive. When these practices were undermined or forbidden, it was not just a loss of cultural expression, but a loss of their role, their purpose, and their connection to their heritage. The feeling of losing one's identity, of seeing one's cultural world slowly disappear, was a profound psychological burden. It created a sense of disconnect from their ancestors and a blurring of who they were. While some elements of local culture might persist and even influence the conquerors over time, the initial period of conquest was marked by a deliberate effort to homogenize and assimilate conquered populations into the new power structure. This meant that women were often on the front lines of this cultural battle, grappling with the challenge of preserving their heritage in the face of immense pressure to conform. The weight of cultural erasure was a slow, persistent form of brutality, threatening not just their physical lives but the very essence of who they were, silently chipping away at their identity and connection to their past. Number 1. The burden of family fragmentation. Imagine the sudden, inexplicable void left by a loved one who is simply gone. No goodbye, no explanation. Just an empty space where they once were. For women in newly conquered territories around 670, the burden of family fragmentation was perhaps one of the most agonizing and pervasive realities. Conquest was a brutal force that tore apart the very fabric of social life, shattering kinship networks and leaving countless women to bear the immense weight of loss, uncertainty, and solitary struggle. In traditional societies of the era, the extended family was the bedrock of existence. It provided economic support, emotional comfort, protection, and a sense of belonging. Husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons were often the primary laborers, defenders, and links to the wider community. But during conquest, these male relatives were often the first to be targeted. They might be killed in battle, rounded up and enslaved, or forced to flee, leaving women widowed, orphaned, or completely alone. The immediate aftermath of a military takeover often saw the brutal separation of family members with little or no chance of reunion. Imagine a wife desperately searching for her husband among the corpses, or a mother frantically calling out for her sons amidst the chaos of fleeing refugees. Chroniclers of the period, while not always focusing on individual suffering, often speak of the immense human toll of wars, hinting at the countless families ripped apart. Children, particularly vulnerable, suffered immensely from this fragmentation. They might be orphaned if both parents perished or were taken. These children could end up as street beggars, adopted into new, unfamiliar families, or even sold into servitude, their childhood stolen, their futures uncertain. Women who survived often found themselves as the sole guardians of their children with no other family support. This meant an immense burden of responsibility, trying to provide for and protect their offspring in a world that offered little security. The desperation of a mother trying to shield her children from starvation, disease, or further violence, often with no one to lean on, was a profound and constant agony. Elderly women, who had once been respected matriarchs and sources of wisdom within their extended families, faced a different kind of burden. If their children or younger relatives were killed, enslaved, or displaced, they could be left utterly alone, without the support system that was essential for their survival in a world without social welfare. They might find themselves dependent on the charity of strangers, or simply succumb to hunger and neglect. The sense of isolation and despair for those who had lived long lives surrounded by loved ones only to find themselves deserted in their twilight years must have been overwhelming. The breakdown of extended family networks had far-reaching consequences. These networks had provided informal social safety nets for generations, offering assistance during illness, old age, or times of need. When these networks were shattered, women lost crucial sources of aid, advice, and emotional comfort. There was no one to turn to for help with childbirth, no one to share the burden of daily chores, No one to mourn with the psychological impact of such profound loss and grief was immense. Women carried the weight of their own trauma, compounded by the suffering of their children and the constant worry about missing loved ones. The desperate search for family members, often futile, became a driving force for many, yet it rarely yielded positive results. In many instances, women were forced to become the heads of households under the direst circumstances. They had to take on roles that were traditionally held by men, making crucial decisions about survival, shelter, and sustenance, all while grappling with the emotional scars of their losses. This was a testament to their resilience, but also a reflection of the brutal pressures they faced. The social structures that had provided security and identity for generations were profoundly disrupted, replaced by a terrifying uncertainty. The burden of family fragmentation was not just about the loss of individuals. It was about the shattering of a way of life, leaving women to pick up the pieces of their broken families in a world that had been violently rearranged, their lives forever marked by the gaping holes left by those who were gone.